Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 23rd of August, and today's upload is going to be really interesting because we're looking at a wide range of advances by both sides. We're going to begin with the Russians closing in on the village of Komyshuvakha, which is on the border between Dnipro and Donetsk. Furthermore, we'll look at what's going on to the east of Myrnohrad with a counterattack launched by Skala towards the village of Myrny, along with Russian attacks towards Shachove. But the main focus of today's upload will be on the Ukrainian withdrawal from at least one village and potentially another one within the Kleban-Byk pocket. So we're going to analyze the orders of battle over there, but we'll also look at what's going on a bit to the east, in the area directly to the east, actually, of the city of Konstantinivka. We'll look at the Serebryansky forest, and we'll finish off by looking at the western edge of the Zaporizhzhia front. Well, let's zoom in over here on the village of Kimishuvakha because you can see how the Russian advance over here has continued day after day. And this time, based on updates from Deep State, they've been able to acquire 8.8 square kilometers of territory in one fell swoop. So the Russian forces over here, if we're going to take a maximalist impression of the advance going horizontally westwards, then they were able to push 5 kilometers in the direction and are now pretty close to the outskirts of the village itself. In the process, they're overrunning a lot of the fortified tree lines and anti-tank ditches set up by the Ukrainians over here. And at this point in time, the reason that's happening is because the Ukrainians are unable to hold on to retain forward positions. They're simply too overextended because this is a pocket with a lot of these very narrow sort of outstretches and outposts. And so it's very difficult for individual squads to be sent and dispatched to each sort of holdout location. So eventually just the line falters and consolidates around the perimeter of the town. But now we're seeing that manifest, and it's going to be easier for the Russians to then storm into the village. And because it is so small in surface area, there's going to be no way for the Ukrainians to actually engage in a back and forth while the Russians are still embarking upon their offensive activities. So just looking at this remaining part of Donetsk Oblast, it amounts to, let's measure it over here, it is becoming smaller and smaller by the day due to the capture of open fields and fortifications by the Russian side, but there's still about 30 square kilometers of territory that needs to be seized by the Russians before they take over this final vestige of Donetsk Oblast. And of course, you do have the other outcropping in Donetsk, which is just to the east of the Vavcha River, which the Ukrainians have recently been able to consolidate and push further eastwards. So we talked about that in yesterday's video. But to just reiterate what's going on in Komyshuvakha, first of all, the Ukrainians simply have not beefed up their defenses over here in the same fashion that we've seen with other locations and nearby. So that's because simply the Ukrainians don't have enough forces to disperse them across every single individual location where there could theoretically be this sort of Russian breach, as we're seeing right over here. But due to the fact that this is a rather open area and the Ukrainians are stretched out then over here, and the forces that are actually deployed are on the lower scale when it comes to quality. You look at the forces deployed over here, you have these independent battalions that aren't even attached to their mother brigade, if they even have one. You have the 17th National Guard Brigade, which is, one of the better units in relative terms compared to some of the territorial defense brigades that you look at over here, like the 110th or the 122nd. And so that just gives you an idea of the fact that this area is actually far-reaching when it comes to its span across the front line, but it does not receive proportional amount of support. And so for a while, the Ukrainians were able to just deal with this because the Russian forces didn't have much of the initiative over here. They weren't necessarily focusing on closing in on Komyshuvakha in the same way they're doing now. And they could rely on the drone crews, which, by the way, aren't necessarily the strongest over here for the Ukrainians. And now the dynamic is completely flipped. And so Komyshuvakha will certainly be used as an outpost by the Russian side for their own objectives of crossing over the border, solidifying control over numerous villages that are also rather isolated from larger defense hubs like Veli Myrnohrad, which is on the northern bank of the Vavcha River. So that's going to be a logistical concern for the Ukrainians going forward. But also in order to sort of hook to the southwest, as we've talked about consistently in numerous videos, and overrun this second rear line of Zaporizhzhia. I think that's also a part of the consideration over here because it's all part of a ploy to get control over the remaining, 27% of Zaporizhzhia under Ukrainian control, doing so from an unorthodox routes, which eventually will focus their sort of tail sights on Yanchor and the entire river valley over here. So certainly something to keep an eye out for. And Komyshuvakha right now is in the midst of this enclosure by the Russian side. So keep an eye out for the way in which that develops, because I don't expect the pace of the Russian attacks to really dissipate at the moment. As we zoom in over here, though, this is an area where the Ukrainians have been able to launch their own attack. So this is rather interesting. So, as you guys know, we've been tracking very closely the Battle of Novohrodivka, and in recent weeks, due to the combined efforts of units like the 255th Motor Rifle Regiment and even perhaps the 110th, which is located a bit to the north, and then also allegedly the 5th Motor Rifle Brigade, they're able to clear out the entirety of the village. And this is an area that the Ukrainians held on to because it's not necessarily the largest in service area, but there are a lot of houses over here. It's rather dense in that regard. So the Ukrainians were able to mount a protracted defensive campaign in this area and hold out against numerous Russian attacks up until a point where they were simply unable to retain control over individual houses and basements and dugouts and such. So they were pushed out of there. They were also pushed out of some of the nearby mines and some of the tree lines that are a bit to the west as well. And we'll get to that in a moment. But with the pressure continuously getting closer and closer to the city of Myrnohrad itself, the Ukrainians devised a scheme to at least momentarily divert attention away from the village itself or the town itself. Myrnohrad is a large town. You look at the Russian vectors of attack, and you can see how they're closing in on the northeastern outskirts of Myrnohrad, getting very close to the T0504 highway that is used as the main entrance point into the town. And then from there can sort of reach the center and some of the northern chunks of the town. So again, really important entrance points that the Russians are approaching right now, and doing so from an area that's not necessarily the most fortified, because they're not conducting a frontal assault from the east necessarily, because that area is much more dense when it comes to Ukrainian defenses. Instead, they're circumventing it by attacking from the north, utilizing the tactical heights they took over due to the capture of this Terrakon. So what are the Ukrainians doing? They're opting to exploit a gap in the Russian line. And this is something that we've talked about, but I should have mentioned it more admittedly. The fact that Myrnohrad has never necessarily been the most solidly under Russian control. Yes, it's been marked as Russian controlled territory on my map for months now, but especially the northern chunk of the town has never been that solid in their grasp. Perhaps it was during certain periods of time, but as the Russian focus shifted northwards to Vuhledar, Mirny, and then from there to the outskirts of Myrnohrad, there wasn't necessarily an emphasis on beefing up the defenses over here in Myrnohrad or to then pursue an attack towards these open fields over here. There was never the impetus by the Russian side to do so because, again, this is an area that's a bit less relevant to the course of the battles and the course of the pocket that it would include Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. Because pushing from Myrnohrad, crossing over the Tras River, which is going to be difficult because it's on low elevation, and then having to overrun a lot of thick defenses that you can't even see on the map over here, it's simply not worth the potential benefits, which would be approaching the outer perimeter of the city in an area that's also rather well defended. So there was never a Russian investment in this location, even though on paper they held onto it. So there were several examples of the Ukrainians just sending in vehicles, armored vehicles, to try to enter into the village and fire on the Russian forward positions. But for the most part, they were quelled. So now what we're seeing is a Ukrainian advance through an even weaker point along the northernmost outskirts of Myrnohrad and the southernmost outskirts of Mykolaievka, an area that's largely open but does contain a couple of forest brushes, which are important because they're used as concealment for small squads. They crossed over a low-lying river valley, and it's pretty much a floodplain at this point, so crossing over the actual barrier of water is not difficult. And then from there, they took advantage of this hedgerow and were able to make it all the way to this region. And let's measure the distances just to give you guys an idea. They pushed about 3 kilometers to the northeast, and this geolocation confirms it. This is from August 22nd based on satellite imagery. And so the Russian FPV struck in this video 3 Ukrainians as they were advancing in a group just south of Mirny. So Romanov does claim, and again, obviously take what he says with a grain of salt. He's not the most reliable source, but he's claiming that the Ukrainians were able to enter into Mirny itself and that there are currently clashes going on. And this is denied by Radov. So there is a bit of a back and forth going on between both sides about the veracity. But for now, I'm just going to say that based on the geolocated evidence, there is an indication that the Ukrainians have been able to exploit this line largely due to the efforts of the 425th Skala Assault Regiment in this case. And you can see over here how this is from the Ukrainian side. They captured 3.3 square kilometers of territory. And now this is interesting because it's going to force the Russian side to focus on this penetration, lest the Ukrainians continue exploiting it and actually do cut off the T0504. because the fear would be at that point that the logistics from the rear, and you're looking at areas like, Vuhledar, and then from there it sort of branches out to areas, Shcherbynivka and Avdiivka and such. So the routes that they use sort of originate from this rail line region where you have Shcherbynivka, and then sort of branches out along this paved road to Vuhledar, then takes a turn along the ring road, and then from there branches out to the line of contact. And so the fear would be that the Ukrainian DRGs begin harassing that line and make it impossible for the Russian side to move in forward elements to those areas. And so that will necessitate a Russian response and therefore divert attention away from their current gains made towards Myrnohrad itself. So I do expect there to be a significant Russian response to quell this, but in the process, it's also going to reduce the pace of attacks on the city of Myrnohrad itself. So again, 3.3 square kilometers in an area like this, it is a pretty notable amount. What's being claimed by Romanov, and I can't confirm this, is that the 5th Motor Rifle Brigade, they're the ones that took most responsibility for the capture of Novohrodivka, whereas other units that we mentioned before may have played a larger role, and now they're the unit that was responsible for basically being unable to hold the line in this particular sector. So, that's possible because I've put them over here for a while around this general deployment zone. But there were a couple of other ones like the Sparta Battalion and a couple of BARS units, but I do need to refine the map over here. But all in all, looking at this area north of Myrnohrad, this can explain the Ukrainians' intentions because you can see that the Russians captured 1.84 square kilometers of territory, and this included control over several mine shafts and industrial facilities, a couple of these forested areas that engulf and encircle the industrial zones. So this is a video from August 23rd. It's from the 1st Operational Battalion Jaguar, which is a part of the 14th National Guard Brigade. I have them marked over here on the map. So they conducted FPV strikes onto these Russian infantry west of the Stakhanov mine, which is, I think, this one over here, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's this one. I don't remember. But in any case, it's west of some of these mining facilities and includes some of these tree lines as well, as the Russians actually got very close to arriving at the city confines in this particular location. And this is, again, a very concerning area for the Ukrainians going forward, because whereas you had Scala and other associated units like the 68th Jaeger, 32nd Mechanized, 155th Mechanized, and such that were involved in quelling the DRG infiltration into Pokrovsk, the overarching threats to the city was never going to be primarily from that, unless there was going to be some sort of exploitation at some point, which never materialized. But the overarching fear comes from the northeast, and that includes the potential fall of Rodinska and Chervony Liman, which would then lead to the capture of key heights and a northern flank overlooking Myrnohrad itself, both in terms of the topography, but also just having a northern flank to cut off supply access to Myrnohrad. And then from there, exploiting open fields, Harav at Hrishny. That's a very palpable fear, and also the most realistic way in which this pocket will end up falling, because the Ukrainians have been able to sufficiently beef up the defenses and entry points into most of the city of Pokrovsk, although there are still clashes going on northeast of Leontovichi, near Troyanda, in the Kleban-Byk microdistrict, but it is far less copious than it was a couple of weeks ago, especially during late July, early August, that period of time. But now the Russians are making inroads in this area, capturing, advancing about 1 kilometer southwards and making inroads in areas that are overlooking Myrnohrad, getting close to some of the key Ukrainian frontline defense nodes, and taking them out one by one will create the conditions needed to eventually close the entirety of the pocket, which is why the Ukrainians felt the need to just divert attention by conducting this attack in an area that they realized was rather thin. So we are seeing a lot of aerial activity by the Russian side, especially in recent days. So they've conducted just numerous FAB strikes, dozens on various tree lines in areas that the Ukrainians have re-entered during the course of their counterattacks to Zoloty Kolodiaz and Vilna. We have this one tree line over here to the east of Vilna that's been subject to tens of these sort of FAB strikes in recent days. So they're under the radar. They're on the radar, rather, of the Russian side, and they're being targeted as such, because now you're seeing accumulations of Ukrainian forces due to the fact that they're consolidating control over a large chunk of territory, and it creates the perfect conditions for the Russians to employ FABs. So during the nighttime period, this is when it's the most sort of egregious, the sort of Russian firepower over here. You see a lot of FAB strikes on a daily basis. I'm sure that over here in this general sector, it's probably reaching the like over 100, hundreds possibly. And so you're reaching the point of, I should say, dozens and not hundreds, because we're still in this period where the monthly strikes on the sector are at around 900, and perhaps they're going to cross over that 1,000 mark. So you do the math and divide it by 30 and 31, then you'll realize that it's not in the hundreds. But certainly, when you add up the FAB strikes and then the FPV strikes on the entrance and exit points to cities like Pokrovsk, along some of the key routes that are still being used by the forces going into the city, I'll give you guys examples. The E50 highway is being used, but to a lesser degree than the Hrishnya road, which is the most popular road being used by the Ukrainians right now, and then sort of branches off depending on the desired location of the Ukrainian withdrawal force. You also have this outstretched road that connects to the vertical road from Dobropilya, and then from there could sort of split off to western or eastern, rather, Pokrovsk and western Myrnohrad, as you can see over here on the map. And then you have the local routes that I mapped out before, but I removed it because of congestion, that you could just generally see over here. And using the entirety of the vertical route is simply not feasible now, because any vehicular movement is spotted immediately by Russian forces, including DRGs over here, and they're able to fire directly and engage in ambushes against those forces. So that should give you guys an idea of the supply situation over here. But again, what I was talking about is the fact that you're seeing numerous FPV strikes on a daily basis targeting entrance and exit points to the city, including Dobropilya. Now we're seeing a huge influx of FPV strikes along the eastern outskirts of the city, along with Shahid strikes that are not only being used on the Ukrainian rear on key cities, but they're now also being deployed in a sort of tactical manner to target forces on the ground over here, Ukrainian outposts and force accumulations. So hardened structures could also be struck in fortifications as well. So we're seeing the deployment of Shahids over here. We're seeing the deployment of FABs. So just a whole array of them being used. And then also the DRGs are most active at night. So that's why I say that the intensity ramps up during that period of time. But for now, not much when it comes to concrete advances. Where we do see Russian advances is actually in the same area that we talked about yesterday. The Russians are getting very close to this key heights on market right over here that overlooks Sofivka, Shachove, and Volodymyrivka. The Russians are advancing over here, and you can see that they captured 1.5 square kilometers of territory. Looking at the extent, it's 1.2 kilometers northwards. There's a geolocation over here from August 18th, so it is a bit of an older video of the 117th Mechanized Brigade, basically the main vanguard force in this area that's defending against this Russian spearhead. And they conducted FPV strikes and grenade drops onto the tree lines that are to the east of Shechove, as I described it. And so the Russians are just chipping away at Ukraine's positions over here that include tree lines that have dugouts contained inside of them. And then also this line of anti-tank ditches, which is rather well built, and to a certain degree also includes Dragon's Teeth. So those are areas where the Ukrainians are resisting and trying to drag out fighting, but it only works up until a certain point, because the clashes over here are occurring in areas that are extremely isolated and disconnected from the Ukrainian rear bases. Even the relative proximity of the village of Shachove to the line of contact to the east isn't really relevant, because Shachove itself is under immense strain right now. So having that sort of 6-kilometer gap or connection isn't really useful to either of them, besides the fact that it prevents encirclement. It's not really going to be used to facilitate much supply during daylight hours. For Ukrainian forces that are defending in these tree lines, that assume they're getting most of their sustenance directly from the northern axis, rather than this sort of movement coming in from the paved road and then branching out eastwards. I doubt that's what's going on right now, due to the Russian aerial presence in this region. So what I'm trying to get at is the fact that the Russians are getting very close to this pond region, and then from there we'll have in sort of a salient, I should say, that can be used to overlook and flank and just squeeze out the Ukrainian possessions in this river line. So I believe that's a part of the broader Russian objective of just widening their salient that still anchors around Kocherov, despite the reports that it was taken over by the Ukrainians. Still no signs of that. Over here, this is what I wanted to talk about most in today's video, is the fact that the Ukrainians have now withdrawn from the village of Shcherbynivka in its entirety. So this occurred after months upon months of resistance, and it started out around the perimeter of the village, and just gradually the Russians chipped away from the Zaporizhzhia microdistrict in the east, or from the south where you have Leonidivka, and made numerous inroads, but the Ukrainians consistently counterattacked and were able to maintain a very strong outward defense. So that robust defensiveness is what allowed the Ukrainians to hold out within that populated area, while the flanks were just caving in on themselves in areas that were much worse in terms of their defensive outlook. So, for instance, the western flank of Shcherbynivka just completely collapsed because you're looking at an area that's extremely open, disconnected from the logistics nodes in Konstantinivka. And yeah, the Russians just exploited those open fields to seize large swaths of territory that can't be manned by each individual Ukrainian unit. So that, once again, did diminish the sort of standing and support that Novospassk and Shcherbynivka would receive, and allowed the Russians to sort of turn their focus eastwards to attack the Ukrainian holdouts. And then from the east, you also have the continued presence of Russian soldiers in the northeast of Shcherbynivka, expanding out of Toretsk towards the mine over here where there are currently clashes going on. It's called the St. Matrona mine, St. Matrona of Moscow mine. But around August 21st, this is when this happened, the Ukrainian forces that had remained in Shcherbynivka completed their withdrawal and consolidated around Kleban-Byk, which is where most of the Ukrainian forces that are located south of the reservoir are still situated. Now, there's a question about Counterattack because some Ukrainian sources allege they also withdrew from this village, but there's no geolocated evidence to back this up. And the loss of Counterattack would mean that the remaining corridor out of the reservoir from this eastern direction is only about 1.3 kilometers, if we're being generous. So that sort of decision from the Ukrainian side, if it was not forced due to a Russian assault, it would be sort of difficult to conceptualize, because it would just be putting a lot of eggs into one basket, because admittedly the Ukrainian forces do have a pretty large garrison over here. And that's part of why they've been able to defend successfully. They've been able to rotate out forces, and they have a tiny grouping of units that are all from the same sort of umbrella, same corps in certain cases, a lot of them coming from certain National Guard elements, some coming from the National Police Force, and have been working in unison for over a year now. So they have that level of cohesiveness that other parts of the front line don't have, and they've been able to exhaust Russian offensive potential numerous times in the past. So they already have experience in that regard. To show you guys the order of battle over here, just very briefly, you have a lot of these special purpose centers. I don't even have all of them on the map, but I'll add them in eventually. And they're a part of the National Police Brigade sort of a family. So over here, you have the 22nd Infantry Battalion. You have a lot of these separate battalions as well. They're active around here. The National Guard Brigade Leopard is active over here. You have rifle battalions. You have the 22nd National Guard Brigade. You have over here, again, TDF Brigade. But you do have some mechanized units like the 100th Mechanized Brigade. I know they're somewhere over here. You have the Predator Police Patrol Brigade. You have the, I think it's all Tsunami Regiment. So they're active over here as well. The Utes generally floating around here as well. You have the 125th Heavy Mechanized Brigade. You have 117th Sumi TDF Brigade. Separate Presidential Brigade generally operating around here. At least one of its battalions engaged in the Kleban-Byk fighting. So yeah, the list goes on. You do have a pretty large grouping of Ukrainian forces, and it's across an area of the front line that right now, due to these closures of pockets, is not exactly the widest. And so that's good for the Ukrainians, because it means that they can continue dragging out the fighting in the areas they do desire to retain control over, or at least keep the Russians at bay at. But it reaches a point where the corridors of escape are so narrow that even a sufficient amount of forces to manage is not going to be enough to hold the line. So that's basically what I'm foreseeing over here with Kleban-Byk, especially if Counterattack fell. Because we know that there were efforts by the 68th Tank Regiment to take it over, but those were unsuccessful. And at least it's a gray zone at this point, but I've not changed it because there's no indication to really point there besides just my own intuition. But you have the 103rd Motor Rifle Regiment. They've been able to push and take over this 5.2 square kilometer chunk of territory that the Ukrainians withdrew from. In the process, they were able to capture what amounts to 3.4 kilometers in the northward direction. And on August 23rd, the 103rd Regiment cleared Ukrainian strongholds, so they're taking over these Ukrainian fortifications just to the east of Counterattack, which will give them, if they haven't already, the necessary base to attack towards the village, and then also naturally to Kleban-Byk and cut off the entirety of the reservoir. There's currently an effort by some Russian forces to the west to cut off this other corridor, which is very close to the sort of reservoir and dam itself. It's only about 1.6 kilometers away, and we're looking at an area that's not very well fortified. There are some tree lines and forested patches, but no fortifications, no settlements and such. You just have the Bichok River. And so the fact that the Russians have been unable to cut it off is just due to their lack of commitment over here, I would say. Perhaps the fact that they're distracted by fighting a bit to the northwest. But it's also due to the fact that the Ukrainians do have a large density of forces and have been able to exhibit defensive gumption, including the innate police battalion over here, 109th TDF Brigade. List goes on, really. You have a lot of forces over here trying to hold up this gap because it does provide an opportunity and an escape route for, Ukrainian remnants that are holding out in the reservoir. But obviously, within the context of doing so in small groups and in a fast manner, preferably at night. So that's a lot of what we're seeing from this part of the front line. You do still have the reservoir itself, and you can see over here how I'm measuring what remains of it. I want to get an understanding of the extent of the Ukrainian possession over here, and it amounts to around 25 square kilometers, I'd say, if we're being fair with the estimates. And a lot of it includes defensive lines that are sort of defending against a direct assault. But that's why the Russians were just trying to avoid it all entirely and attack the supply routes and the entry exit points. So that's going to be important to keep in mind moving forward as the Russians try to set up the conditions for a frontline assault on Konstantinivka. That includes numerous fab bombardments of Stepanivka. I would not be surprised if we see a Russian move to take over these locations because there are a lot of these Ukrainian possessions, including some trenches that are around the T0504 highway. So these locations are on high ground and overlook Yablonivka, for instance, where the Russians are organizing forces. So it's incumbent upon the Russians to get control over those locations, both in order to nullify Ukraine's advantage over the Russians on a local level, but also to use it as a springboard to attack towards the low-lying areas like Novohrodivka, Rozkishny, Stepanivka, etc. These areas over here that are all connected by the same paved road. So there's likely going to be an assault on those areas in order to develop a base needed to launch attacks towards Konstantinivka from the southwest. That seems like a likely option with the indications coming from fabs. Whenever you see a fab preparation trying to destroy a concentrated location near the front line, especially like a tree line, that's usually indicative of preparation for an assault because we've seen that already with the area to the northwest of this highway. We've seen it with the breakthrough towards Shcherbynivka and Zolty Kolodias. So I just see history repeating over here. But in any case, let's finish off with the Serebryansky forest because there are a couple of updates from here. Russian forces once again have taken over and cleared out additional pockets. So this forest is continuing to fall at a rapid pace into Russian hands due to Ukrainian withdrawals. So we can see over here how some of the final outstretched pockets of Ukrainian presence are caving in on themselves because it's simply unfeasible at this point to hold on over there as the Russians are closing in and the escape routes are becoming further and further narrower. You can see over here that this is a major bottleneck, this region. It spans about 1.5 kilometers from north to south between the Russian forward positions near this installation in the middle of the forest and then the Donetsk River itself. And so this is an area that can potentially be cut off, and that means that there's going to be further impetus on the Ukrainians to withdraw from their remaining outstretched locations. And these are areas that are holding out with, pretty large width. So there's a lot of width to this Ukrainian pocket, but it's not necessarily the largest when it comes to the sort of vertical expansiveness. So it's not like vertically impressive. It's not spanning much from north to south. You can see over here that it spans about 2 kilometers in the vertical direction. But in terms of its width, this pocket over here, this most outstretched pocket spans about 10 kilometers. So you're looking at a really deep location where the Ukrainians are still present that is simply untenable at this point. The reason why they're still here is because they have a bit of leniency due to the fact that some of it is located just adjacent to some of the Ukrainian positions south of the Donetsk River, and then from there they can sort of feed into the areas near the Finger Lakes where the Russians haven't necessarily been the most active. But this is another area that is simply not going to hold out long term. The Russians already took 3 square kilometers of territory within LPR and within Luhansk, rather, and you can see over here how they captured 15 square kilometers largely within Donetsk. And when it comes to the diagonal advance, it's about 4.4 kilometers moving southwestwards. So this is an important advance because, yet again, another one of these outstretched Ukrainian footprints located generally to the east of Torske has been taken over by the Russian side. Now they're getting very close to asserting a new front line running along the Zherbets River itself. And then from there, they get pretty close to Yampil. Yampil would be within the Russian purview. And so would all the forested routes approaching Liman. They would all be within the grounds of a potential Russian assault. Now, looking at Luhansk, I want to zoom in over here on Rakivka because the Ukrainians have been able to retake the village. In the process, retook what amounts to, what is that, 1.46 square kilometers of territory. We have this video here from August 23rd of the 252nd Motor Rifle Regiment, wherein they dropped grenades onto houses within this hamlet. So previously it had been taken over by this unit, but they've been pushed out. And that's because this area is peripheral to Russian objectives. And the Ukrainians do have a rather small presence over here, but it is a tight-knit group which has the ability to counterattack, namely the 4th Mechanized Battalion of the Presidential Brigade. So over here you can see that, and I do want to just adjust the caption over here to say that it's Ukraine and it's Luhansk over here. But in any case, let's finish off the video by zooming in on what's going on in Zaporizhzhia, because we have two updates from the coastal region near what remains, I suppose, of the Dnieper River. So you can see over here how the Russians have once again turned the tide in this sort of Stepanakert direction, as I refer to it. So northeast of Kamyansk, they captured 2.38 square kilometers of territory. Looking at the northern advance, it amounts to about 2 kilometers. And you could see how they also captured most of Plavny. So Plavny is an area where the 210th, I believe that's what it's referred to as, the 210th Assault Regiment, were able to counterattack, push the Ukrainians out of, or rather the Russians out of Stepanakert first and then out of Plavny. But over here you can see how the tides have turned and the Russians took back in an advance of 2.3 kilometers northwards most of the village, meaning that now the Russians have a rather solid base. It's not very narrow, it's broader, even though it's not the most penetrating and has not been able to reach the outskirts of Stepanakert yet. But this is the way in which the Russians are trying now to adapt to the situation, because they've been unable to exploit narrow corridors for attacks because it's easier for Ukrainian drone crews and infantry to just concentrate their efforts on those particular locations rather than having to deal with the broader span of the front line, which is why the Russian side is now adjusting and beginning to attack across a line of about 5 kilometers, whereas before it may have been 1 or 2 kilometers, depending on the direction of the assault. So that's really it when it comes to the frontline updates. Thank you guys for watching. I'm feeling a bit better now, so I appreciate the support recently. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.